Let's get started. We're, as you know, talking about a fascinating topic at an extraordinary moment. And we certainly have two experts here to enlighten us. Orrenius is a senior economist and a vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. She's a senior fellow at the Tower Center. She has many associations, Baylor University here in Dallas, the American Enterprise Institute, the AEI Institute in Bonn, Germany, and she also worked in the George W. Bush White House, advising him on immigration, and he came up with a good bill, as I recall, that I thought was worthy of support, but it didn't pass. That was long ago and far away. And although you perhaps have heard the news that the administration is now saying that perhaps some illegal immigrants might indeed become legal, which is certainly encouraging news, and we hope that's true. Jim Hollifield is well known to all of us. He is the director of the Tower Center, and as a director, he has really made this an important organization in the community, on campus, in this part of the world. And Jim has a way of always moving to the center of action. I mean, what did he start working on a couple of years ago? But a special effort on Mexico. He got it funded. Here he is in the right place at the right time, as he usually is. He also knows a lot about immigration. He lectures, he writes, he consults. He's been at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington working on this question, and he has a lot to bring to the issues that are vexation to us all. But Peter, first, you have some. We are going in for the real facts tonight. Everybody has some alternatives, of course, but Peter's going in for the real facts. She's like that, and you're on.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Great. I thought we'd just start with looking at some of the recent trends in immigration. We'll look at Europe very briefly, and then we'll look at the United States, and we'll draw some contrasts. Yeah, great. I think I can stand, maybe that's easier. Great, so let me just sort of walk you through some numbers so that when we discuss this topic and trends and sort of what's going on, comparing US and Europe, let's sort of be on the same page. So how well can you see that? I'm wondering, it looks a little bit...
Pretty far down, but just if you can give us a summary.
Yes, anyway, you see this large spike is basically, these are detections of illegal migrants by Frontex, which is the European Border Patrol. And basically this giant spike in 2015 is really the media story that you heard of last year, and in 2015, this huge increase in asylum seekers, a lot of them from Syria and Afghanistan, as we'll see. So this is really the contrasting picture because you won't see a similar spike for the US. This is asylum applications, again, a large increase in 2015, and up to 1.2 million. And just to give you an idea, and we'll get to the chart, but not to spend too much time on this, but 1.2 million asylum applications were filed in Europe in 2015, and it was about 35,000 asylum applications in the United States. Okay, so just so you get a sense of the relative volume, there's a reason why this is such a controversial issue in Europe, and why really it doesn't need to be here, because we really haven't seen these types of increases here on this side. This just shows the origins, the countries of origin. Like I said, and in Europe, they don't have a well-defined, they really don't know the difference between an unauthorized immigrant and an asylum seeker, so they're kind of mixed together. They don't have a way to measure it, but so here you can see in either case, the main senders are Syria and Afghanistan, and then some Middle Eastern countries, Pakistan. Where do they go? If you look at sort of how they define unauthorized immigrants, they're concentrated in Greece in the 2015 data, and in Germany, followed by France, really the larger economies, the larger countries in Europe. But if you look at asylum applications or asylum applicants specifically, you see that Germany is the first in terms of volume, followed by France and then by Sweden. But really, Sweden has been in the news, right? Because President Trump called out Sweden as an example of where, this surge of immigration was an example where it had been very disruptive. But here you can see in terms of asylum applicants per capita, Sweden leads the pack by far, followed by Malta, Hungary. So it's a very different picture when you control for the size of the population. You can see that really Sweden is an outstanding or an extreme case in terms of their, they really had an open door policy. But of course, like you saw in the data, Europe really turned, they've really changed their policy now. That's why you see the steep rise in 2015, a sharp drop in 2016. And similarly in Sweden, what they did is basically after they saw huge amounts of asylum seekers come in 2015, they shut the door. I mean, they had to. It was 180,000 that year, and they were running out of housing. It was December in Sweden, and they were putting them in tents. And then they decided, no, we simply cannot, as you may understand. Yes, it's. Then they realized they had reached their limit in terms of how many they could take. And this is also maybe difficult for you to see, but in terms of just to show you where the fences are coming up in Europe. So Europe didn't have walls like we have. Plenty of fence. We have about 700 miles of fence on the southwest border, and but Europe didn't really have any walls, but they're building them now. So this really shows, between the northern part of Greece, of Turkey, and really more in Eastern and Central Europe, there's more and more fences going up, more and more controls being implemented to stop the flow of people. And of course they have this agreement now with Turkey, but I'll let you talk about that, Jim, because I don't know that much about it. But that's how I understand they've been able to stop the flow, is by agreeing with that Greece would send, and with Turkey, that they would send this arriving asylum seekers now to Turkey to stay there. Just to give you the contrast with this increase in Europe is not matched by any type of immigration increase in the United States. This is just looking at different types of immigration into the U.S. However you cut the data, there's no increase. We're not even past the levels we were at before the Great Recession, okay? So really, whether it's, really the only category that's steeply rising is student visas. That continues to increase. But temporary workers, lawful permanent residents, they're still below their pre-recession peaks. Humanitarian visas are still below their pre-recession peaks. The unauthorized immigrant population has been falling, has sort of stabilized at around 11 million. U.S. border apprehensions of illegal crossers have declined sharply. And again, I'm sorry you can't see the bottom of the chart, but basically, it's about 400,000 last fiscal year, and that's at a level, it's particularly for Mexicans, at a level that we last saw in the 1970s. So we're at record lows for apprehensions. 400,000 sounds like a lot, but it's still really a record low. When I started looking into this question, we were running well over 1 million apprehensions every year in the early 1990s and through the 1990s. And so, we are really seeing a drop-off in illegal immigration. Here you can see refugee arrivals, same thing, very low, very stable, about 80,000 a year are coming to the U.S. Again, compared with the, what we saw in Europe for 2015 was well over 1 million. And we see asylum applications in the U.S. on the rise, but they're only about 35,000. So again, compare that with Europe where they're over 1 million. I mean, it's really not an immigration crisis in the United States, and I just wanted to start with that, Lee, just to sort of, here's your, these are Jim's slides. But I just wanted to start with that to set the scene. Just it's a strange that right now there's so much attention on this question, given that really it's subsiding.
Well, Pia, as we know, in the first week of February, about 600 people in 11 states were arrested. There have been more, of course, since then, because February ends tonight. NPR reported that it may be that the administration will deport 3 million people. And the Obama administration, we know, deported 3 million. Now, you pay a lot of attention to data. You're a labor expert. What I'd like to know is this: do you have any data on how many jobs became right away available to native-born Americans once those people had been deported? A, how many of them were well-paying jobs? B, how many of them were low-wage jobs? You know, if anybody would know, you would.
I hate to disagree with you, but I don't have that information on how many jobs became available to natives, but probably my guess is most natives wouldn't be taking those jobs, just a wild guess. But certainly that's not to say or make little of the fact that there is labor market competition in the market, in labor markets. There is. I just rolled off this panel on the National Academies of Science. We published in September a report on the employment, on the economic and fiscal impacts of immigration, and talked quite a bit about the labor market impacts as well as the impacts on the fiscal balance. And there are small adverse wage effects of immigration on narrow categories of native workers. So typically it tends to be high school dropouts, or more common is that it's prior immigrants. So bringing in a lot, many more immigrants is bad for prior immigrants, just because they're very similar, or what we call substitutes in the marketplace or in the labor market.
Well, there's a bill in Congress and the Senate, carried by 2 senators, Tom Cotton of Arkansas, David Perdue of Georgia, that would cut the number of legal immigrants in half to about 500,000. And their belief is if we cut the number of immigrants, then wages will go up for the workers who are here. However, that doesn't seem to have happened. This is David Brooks who reported this. The construction industry has 200,000 unfilled jobs right now. Can't fill them. But for whatever reason, they have not raised wages. They have simply cut back on projects and bought back their stock or done other things. So does it really work if you cut immigration? Should wages go up? Should supply and demand be operative?
From what I understand, the bill that they're considering, there are some ideas in there that actually I've proposed in the past in terms of reforming the immigration system. So we have an immigration system that overwhelmingly relies on or gives visas to family-based immigration, and I've argued in the past that more visas, permanent visas, should go to employment-based immigration and not just family-based immigration. So I like that part of the proposal, but I will say that cutting legal immigration by half, that's really is really unthinkable in terms of if you think of the contribution that immigrants are making to labor force growth. So for example, the data we've been working with suggests that well over half of labor force growth over the last 20 years has been due to immigrants and the children of immigrants. And going forward, it's going to be even worse because with the baby boomers retiring over the next decade, all of labor force growth will be due to immigrants and their children. So the less immigration you have, the less growth you will have in terms of the labor force, which really is going to be a problem.
Well, of course, you think of employment and job creation and company creation, and nobody was more upset than Silicon Valley when the administration issued its travel ban, temporary travel ban on people from 7 Muslim nations, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, and Somalia. There's going to be another one issued tomorrow, I think, to replace the one now held up in court. They are very upset because they need this talent. And if they don't get it, they're going to go someplace else if the U.S. becomes inhospitable. I mean, to add to what you were saying, of the 87 privately held startups over $1 billion, over half were started by immigrants. And 71% of them have high-level executives who are immigrants. It would be devastating if we couldn't attract that talent. Is that a danger, do you think? To add this, in Kansas, 2 Indian engineers were shot in a bar by an ex-naval officer who came in and said, "Get out of my country," and shot them dead. This would be discouraging.
Oh, absolutely. It has tremendous impact. We're seeing it also with the Mexican population in terms of how they're reacting to sort of the crackdown that's ongoing. But in terms of if you take a step back and you say, if I want to be sensible about the economics of immigration and I want to reform immigration policy, how am I going to do it? Well, you wouldn't do it in any of these ways. Like if you look at the countries affected by the travel ban, those are overwhelmingly skilled migrants. skilled immigrants with high levels of education in key sectors, engineering, STEM fields. The types of fields, the type of occupations that we need, where there's a lot of vacancies, then we need to fill those. So you wouldn't target this particular population, and so that's what's odd. The economic rationale is really not there.
No, it would seem not to be. Of course, as you pointed out, we're not getting a deluge of immigrants from Mexico. Immigrants are coming from Honduras, from Guatemala, from El Salvador through Mexico. And now a number of them are being deported. If anything criminal can be done up on them, and almost anything can on any of them, apparently, traffic ticket or anything you might name. And the proposal seems to be to dump them on Mexico. The Mexican authorities are very upset, understandably. Would it not make more sense to buy a little fuel, fly a little farther, and take them back to their home countries?
I think what's the other thing that's interesting about the initiatives on immigration policy is that what's really not being taken into account is that these countries, these sending countries, they have recourses available to them. They can retaliate against us. And they don't have to accept anybody back that's not Mexican. So Mexico, if they say no to returning to Central Americans, it will be no. There's nothing that we can do about that. The other thing I want to say, if we really make them mad, they will stop apprehending Central Americans coming to Mexico. So they apprehend every year between 75,000 and 100,000 Central Americans that then we thank them very much, because otherwise we would have all that work at the border. Well, if they want to, they can simply stop apprehending those guys and let them get to the border, and then they can seek asylum, and then we have to deal with an additional 100,000 asylum seekers from Central America. And so there's a lot of recourses available to these countries.
Well, Jorge Castilleja, the former foreign minister of Mexico, has threatened exactly that in an op-ed piece. You're absolutely, that's absolutely right. So, correct me if I'm wrong with these figures, they may be out of date. The average age in the United States is about 35. In Britain, Germany, France, about 47, 48, 49. Now, you may be able to correct those. The reason for this great advantage in a youthful population, and having a youthful population, is due to immigration. Am I wrong about that?
Certainly the rate of, yes, the growth in the youthful population is in large part due to immigration. In terms of, obviously the native-born population is still far larger, but in terms of the rates of growth, the rates of change are highly dependent on immigration. And so that's the other conundrum is, if you have a policy where you want to engender or you want to have faster growth in the future, right now we're growing at 2% GDP growth, maybe a little bit less trend growth. If you want that to be 3%, as the administration has discussed, you're going to need a lot more workforce growth. And so without the immigrants and their children, that's simply not going to be an attainable goal.
So, it seems to me then that we're tending to a crisis that isn't really a crisis.
That's the other thing. I don't see the crisis. We've looked at the data, immigration is slowing, the economy is strengthening, the economy is tightening, the unemployment rate is falling, job creation is very robust. We have reports of widespread labor shortages, even in Texas, where we've been through an oil bust. We have labor shortages now coming up in both low-skilled and high-skilled areas, sectors of the economy. And so I see a large disconnect between sort of the economics of the situation and the policies regarding immigration. So since I can't explain it, I think that might be a good transition over here to Professor Hollifield.
One last question for you, and then we go to Europe where there really are problems. Some observers have said that if the administration manages to wreck Mexico with threats of the wall and threats regarding migration and then dismembering NATO, NAFTA rather, the economy will plummet, as the peso already has plummeted, which could bring immigrants back from Mexico in much larger numbers. Is this a reasonable concern?
It is a reasonable concern. It's another one of these unintended consequences, another one of these where you don't really understand where the policy is going, because it seems like the negative effects are greater than any positive effects that you might see. But certainly, I think in the case of Mexico, the peso losing value against the dollar is a problem, but it's only a serious problem that will cause migration if you have inflation. So people, as long as they can go to the store and buy the things with their salary that they could buy before, then I think you're fine. You're not going to start migrating to the US, because really what the data shows is that people prefer not to migrate. The problem will be if inflation takes off in Mexico. So if inflation takes off and the people find that their, the real value of their salaries is declining, they can buy fewer things, and they start to experience more hardship, then yes, that will cause migration.
Is there a danger of inflation?
We're starting to see the beginnings of it, but the Banco de Mexico, they have an amazing president, and it's Agustin Carstens, as you know, Lee, and
he's very impressive.
Yeah, and so what he had been doing, he's been raising the interest rate, the policy rate there to slow inflation. And when that wasn't working, now what they just started trying something new where they're offering these forward contracts on, which really are quite complicated, on the peso, and that actually stopped the peso's devaluation in its tracks. I think it's back under 20, is that right, Jennifer? Under 20, or right around 20 pesos. So there's some stabilization and some room for hope.
Now, Jim, this is an academic setting. We have some academics here, some Carol and Larry and others. I was surprised, I don't know if you were, to read about a historian from France, you know what I'm going to talk about, named Henri Rousseau.
He's a very, very dear friend, someone I've known for 30 years.
Yes, he's a scholar on the Holocaust, highly respected. Flew to Houston, landed at Hollifield Airport at 2 in the afternoon, was detained and held there until 1 a.m., that's 11 hours. For this reason, he was traveling on a tourist visa, and somehow they managed to learn, the Customs and Immigration people, that he was going to make a $2,000 honorarium for speaking at Texas A&M, not unusual.
Which he's done many times.
Well, and also, scholars are permitted to work on a tourist visa, and nobody seemed to know that in the whole of the Immigration and Customs Service. Finally, he was able to get through his people at A&M. They called the law school dean, they called the president of the university, who finally found an attorney in Fort Worth who was able to start helping at 9 p.m. He had already been there 7 hours. Now, what I would like, and he finally got freed at 1 o'clock and got to A&M.
This has gone viral all around the world.
Of course it has. Now, the question is,
some of the French presidential candidates are tweeting about this.
oh, it may well
You're
Macron.
welcome to come and give talks in French.
Well, Macron, who may very well be the next president of France, has said there's no excuse for this. I would just like to know, how does this serve the nation?
Well, it depends on what nation you're talking about. There are nations that might be better served than our own nation. There's an inside story to this, and I don't know if we're under Chatham House rule.
Oh, why not?
But
Sure. You are, he is.
Unfortunately, Arnold arrived fairly late, and he was supposed to meet the driver who was taking him to College Station when all of this happened. And what's the first thing you should do if you're caught in a situation like this? I don't know how many of you in the audience have ever experienced something like this. Hopefully not too many of you. But you can tell me what would be your first reaction. Of course, you have a right to do this. Well, unfortunately, the consulate was closed.
It's right.
And they didn't have a number. It was late in the evening. But some of you in here may know the French consul. He's been here many times. Woodrow, who's really a very interesting fellow in his own right. They weren't able to get a hold of him until finally they woke him up early in the morning to say we have this big incident at the Houston airport. And it seems to be that the main reason he was detained was not so much the visa thing, although that was one of the reasons. The CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, said that they were doing this because they were concerned that he would work illegally in the U.S. and they were putting him in shackles and going to.
We're going to send it back to Paris.
But the reason he was detained, according to my sources, he was born in Egypt. He was born in Egypt. Is he Arab? No, he's Jewish. His family were Jewish refugees in Alexandria who were expelled when they fled to France. So it was the birthplace, which made it look very suspicious. And I don't know if they have quotas now with the CBP, for finding and stopping people. But this seems to be the policy. So you need to, it's like passing out a certain number of traffic tickets. You've got to meet your quota and stop people who look suspicious. Of course, they had no idea. It's Jewish, not there, but anyway.
Yeah. I have a friend who's German and is married to an American woman from Dallas, actually, living in New York, teaches at NYU, also runs the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt. So he's part of the year in Frankfurt, part of the year in New York. And he has right away got his American citizenship, thinking, well, I want to be able to get back into the country. And I mean, it's kind of absurd that somebody who's lived here for years, has 3 sons in American schools, would have to think that way. But not only has it reached French politics, I mean, now we have Marine Le Pen, who made very well, as everybody expected to get into the runoff. UBS is now saying she has a 40% chance of winning, becoming the next president of France. And what will that mean? I mean, she is virulently anti-immigration. Well, she says there are 2 totalitarianisms left in France: economic globalization and Islamic fundamentalism. So what next do we have President Le Pen?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I should go.
Can she get into this country, do you think?
Can she win? Is that what you're asking?
No, I asked if she could possibly get into the United States if she traveled here.
She was one of the first to call and congratulate President Trump when he was elected. I think right after 9/11.
She came over, she was on the escalator. She was photographed on the escalator at Trump Tower.
So, I mean, what we're witnessing here, and I think because of the way this PowerPoint is set up, I'm going to skip the PowerPoint because it actually shines in our face. And Louisa told me that we will put the PowerPoint for all of you up online so you can go and get it self-fit later. But let me just say a couple of things on the U.S.-Europe comparison, just to sort of set the stage a little bit and take more of these questions. But P and I actually had a little disagreement when we started this program because a lot of people want to talk about the migration crisis. This is, everybody sees this as a crisis. And much to her credit, Pia said, what crisis? There's not a crisis. And so we settled, you saw the title, we settled on the term challenge. But just to get you thinking about this comparison between Europe and the U.S., there is no crisis in America with respect to migration. One of my German colleagues years ago talked about people have a crisis in the head. So this is not a real crisis. And the U.S., unless you count a few 100,000 Central American children, I mean, we could argue about whether that's really a crisis. Certainly it's a crisis for the children, it's a crisis for their families. But, as I said in the talk in Arizona a month or 2 ago, I mean, the U.S. could absorb much of the population of Central America without much of it done. The Germans, on the other hand, in 2015, took almost 1 million people in less than a year. That would be like the United States absorbing 4 million people. Imagine what would happen in this country if we had 4 million people suddenly arrive on our doorstep. What would we do? I mean, think about it. That's a crisis by any means. So, one thing you could ask yourself is, why are Americans, we're usually a pretty stable, calm people. Why are we in such a crisis mode and so paranoid about this? And I do have a picture. I may try to put it up there for you in a minute to try to explain this. But it is true. And then I'll, go back to if you can pull up the box. I don't know. There you go. Go back to the box.
Oh, the box.
Policy making box. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you can't see this, but before I talk about the box for just a second, let me just say that the history of migration is very different in Europe and in the United States. And I'm happy to entertain questions about individual countries. Pia and I actually worked together to put together a big book on this, which I was tempted to bring the book and publicize it. It's called Controlling Immigration. But by and large, Americans, we are a nation of immigrants. We have accepted, how can you not talk about immigration if you talk about the history of the United States? We are an immigrant nation, no question about that. Europe, on the other hand, historically has a different perspective on immigration because immigrants were those who couldn't make it. You know, they were the ones who were sort of cast off, and of course they could go to the Americas or somewhere else. So Europe was traditionally a continent of immigration, people going out. You know, I often ask in audiences like this, you know, is there anybody in here who has any German ancestry? Anybody in here with German ancestry? Okay, there are probably quite a few in this room. And many of you know that there was a lot of opposition to German immigration in the United States initially. You know, Ben Franklin said that we can't have these Germans. You know, they're basically medieval peasants. They don't want to like to live in a free society. But if it gives you some hope, Franklin changed his mind because the Germans became his constituents and his voters in Pennsylvania. And of course, how many of you have Irish ancestry? So, I mean, a lot of you in the room have Irish ancestry. So we can go on and on down the line. So America has a long tradition of immigration, but we do have these bouts of, you know, anti-immigrant fervor, nativism, if you want, and we're clearly in one of these fever pitch moments. But for Europe has a much more recent history of immigration. Although France is slightly an exception. The French were taking people in way back into the 19th century, so they have been receiving immigrants. But for most of the other countries of Europe, you know, this is still a relatively new phenomenon. So there's a sharp contrast here, I would say, between Europe and the United States. So just to go back to these questions and go back to the discussion, and to ask you this question, you know, what would lead the Germans to do this, and the Swedes and others, you know, to take in so many people on such short notice? Immigration politics, you know, it's a four-sided game. And again, the box is going off the picture here, but since we had it up.
I was waiting for
when you think about debates about immigration, in normal times in this country, you could see it in the exchange between Lee and Pia. You know, the questions are on these two sides of the box. How many people do we need? What skills should they have? You know, how long are we going to let them stay? What's going to be their status? So it's an argument in normal times about markets on the one hand, and rights or status on the other. You know, that's a normal debate. We had those debates in the 80s and 90s, and we passed laws, you know, reforming our immigration system. So that's a normal debate. But there are times when the debate gets completely distorted because you've got two other sides to this. One is the security side. So security will interfere with this. And if you are attacked, as we were on September 11th, that changes the whole dynamic of the debate. The final, which you can't see down here on the bottom, is when it becomes cultural. So if we are having a cultural threat of some sort. We saw it with the Chinese in California in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. We passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. We saw it with the Red Scare after World War I, when we passed a very draconian immigration law because we didn't want the East Europeans and we didn't want the Jews coming in. So we've had these bouts in our history. And we can talk about why we're in one of these periods right now where there's a lot of nativism and a lot of fear of immigration. But, you know, sorry to usurp this, but I just wanted to sort of get these points on the table, and, you know, eventually we're going to go to your questions. But Lee, you want to?
Well, of course, the response in Europe has been widespread. You're from Sweden originally, I think, and certainly what Sweden has done is admirable, but there is opposition now to immigration, as you said. They've had to shut it down. The Swiss have had an election in which they've said, no, we want to cool it on immigration. France is well known to us. And not to mention Brexit, Italy is trying to rush up the approval or disapproval of asylum seekers in order to get them out of the country. Brexit, of course, is a problem. It's happened in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia. You have politicians coming to the fore virulently anti-immigration. So the question is, if all these countries begin to close their doors, Viktor Orban has built a fence along Hungary,
and he accused the Germans of moral imperialism. That's what he said.
If this continues, what is going to happen to the 65 million displaced people in the world now, desperately seeking safety in Europe and the U.S., mainly fleeing civil wars in failed states? What's going to become of them?
Well, let me, if I just weigh in on that. I mean, clearly the recent crisis in Europe in particular is a humanitarian crisis. First and foremost, because you've got all these people who are fleeing conflict. And that's why we created the Refugee Convention, you know, to take care of people like this, and that there is a collective international responsibility to do this. So we've all signed these treaties, we've made commitments. So to take care of these humanitarian crises, we have a moral obligation. But of course, you know, we need a policy to do this. And you're absolutely right, Lee. The question is what's going to happen to these people. The Europeans have tried to take in as many as they could. We saw that there are limits as to how many people you can take in. And when Angela Merkel did what was, you know, the humanitarian thing to do and said, okay, we will take the Syrians who can get here. Of course, anytime a politician says something like this, it can then be interpreted as an invitation. And then you fall into what is known, I don't know if there are insurance people in the room or bankers, you fall into the moral hazard, which means you have opened the door and everybody's going to take a risk, so you see all of these people trying to jump through the door before it closes. So she had to reverse herself. But she made one mistake, and you know, it was a pretty big mistake. She thought the other Europeans would share the burden and the responsibility. And they refused to do this. And I'm happy to talk about the European policy. But to go back to Lee's question, what's going to happen to these people? Well, you've got 2 million people trapped in refugee camps in Kenya. Most of the people fleeing Middle East conflicts, they're in Lebanon, they're in Jordan, and now the Europeans are paying the Turks to keep them there. So the question is, should we bottle these people up in these camps? Keep them there. You know, that's perhaps not the best idea for them, because it's destabilizing for the countries surrounding them, where the conflict is taking place, and it creates an enormous fertile recruiting ground for the terrorists and the jihadis, and you get more and more desperate people. Imagine children, you know, growing up in these camps. You know, there's no way out of it for them. So I think, you know, it's a very short-sighted and myopic policy for the United States and the West to shut out the refugees and asylum seekers. We would be much better off trying to address that issue and to allow people to move and hopefully someday to resettle or perhaps even return to their country once the conflict subsides. So, Lee.
Which, you know, Jim, I heard, yes.
Oh, I just wanted to, we just happened, as what Jim was just describing, is where the refugees are in the world, and this map shows it, and just, you know, I think it's very informative because it shows the great concentrations outside of Europe, obviously, and outside the United States. They're overwhelmingly in Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, so it's very instructive.
He mentioned Brexit, and of course, they are finding that movement from Europe into Britain is small, except for Bulgaria and Romania. They're still coming. Now, these are not asylum seekers, nor are they refugees. These are Europeans who thought they could move to Britain legally, but that's coming to an end. And, but it's homeland, and therefore there are industries. The construction industry seems always to be looking for people, food processing industry, healthcare industry, short of people in Britain. So what is this going to mean?
Well, you know, I was at breakfast in Washington, D.C. Last year, and the head of Daimler-Benz was there. And, you know, they were sending teams of people out, and the refugees who were arriving in Germany to recruit them, you know, train them how to be welders, get them working, get them on the production line, because there are labor shortages in these countries. So there's a silver lining in this, that many of these people will settle, they will get jobs, they will become productive members of society, and they will make a contribution to these economies. And I think that also was, again, Merkel was thinking more long-term. You know, Germany needs people. The German economy has been going flat out. It's been growing very fast. So they have a lot of labor shortages. Of course, this will take time. Now, I know some of you in the room, going back to my little box, might say, well, aren't these people a threat? Aren't they a danger in these societies? And I don't know if how many of you saw the statistic the Cato Institute calculated. Listen to this. What are your chances of being killed by a refugee in the United States? They are 1 in 3.6 billion. 1 in 3.6 billion. So is that a threat? Is that a risk? And no refugees. There's one person who was a failed asylum seeker, the Tunisian who drove the truck in Berlin. But the attacks in Europe were not done by refugees. And the attacks in this country were not done by refugees. They are done often by people who have been living in the country, have settled there. Many of them are second generation young people. So you have to ask yourself the question, you know, why do these people become radicalized? And, you know, in Europe, one final point about this, Europe has a very different history in terms of its immigration, because these European countries, many of them were great colonial and imperial powers. So you have the overlay and the overhang of colonialism. Now, you could certainly say the U.S. has its own colonial history, imperial history. You know, Central America at one point was like a wholly owned subsidiary of the United Fruit Company, and we do have this term, banana republic. So we are tied to Central America. We were tied to Vietnam. You know, we fought a war there, and how many Vietnamese fled and came to this country? And the Vietnamese have done pretty well in this country, if you look at it. So, sorry to go on. I know we got to go.
Well,
Response to that?
but you already know.
Can I respond to Jim?
Yes.
Okay. You know I'm going to say it. Just a couple of points. That was a little one-sided, so let me round it out a little bit. So, just a little. So Brexit, and yes, it's true, the UK economy was growing very quickly, and so there was a lot of migration into the UK, where obviously they made good use of these workers. But honestly, if you look at the data, it's a very sharp spike. It was unexpected. It was far more migrants than they expected. And really, under the European Union rules, they were not allowed to control their own borders and control their own immigration. And because they got such a disproportionate amount of migration, I actually have some sympathy for people who think that they should be allowed to control their borders, especially in a situation where they were disproportionately, experiencing the influx of Eastern European migrants. Even if these were migrants that were working and so forth, but still, sharp spikes in migration, from unexpected ones. That's disruptive, and it can be harmful, really, for the labor market, for the native workers. And so I wanted to say that. And I also wanted to say the other problem in Europe is that, they're very generous, they have very generous social welfare systems, and the asylum seekers, get benefits once they file their asylum applications. And so they're actually quite costly. They also have very inflexible labor markets, and so it's actually here, we put them to work right away, because otherwise there's very little support for asylum seekers and refugees in the U.S. And so it's very different in Europe. So this migration is very costly from a fiscal perspective in the short to medium term before these people become productive workers.
Yeah, we have a mutual colleague, Phil Martin, who's a great economist who works on this, and for years he would say that the worst nightmare in Germany, because they have this very inflexible labor market, was that a refugee would come and settle and get a job. Whereas in the U.S., it's exactly the opposite. I mean, if you get refugees here, you want to get them a job and get them in the labor market as quickly as possible. But we probably should go to the audience.
Let's do, yeah. Yes, please.
Jim, a minute ago you were talking about the rationale behind allowing such a great number of immigrants to come in. And I think you partially answered that question with Angela Merkel and her humanitarian component. Was there another compelling reason behind humanitarian? I mean,
yeah, maybe Kia, could you pull that PowerPoint back up? There's one picture I wanted to show.
This is going to cost you extra.
Yeah, there's a picture there somewhere. I had a picture of myself standing in front of a sign somewhere. Yeah, there it is, right there. Because I don't know how many of you speak German, but I thought this would be a good one to look at. And it answers your question very well. This was in Bochum, I think, in the Ruhrgebiet, in the industrial heartland of Germany. And this sign says, Die größte Katastrophe ist das Vergessen, which means the greatest disaster is forgetting. So the Germans, you see what I'm saying? We have an anthropologist on the front row. She understands this. Not so long ago, many of the Germans were themselves refugees and fleeing. 12 million Germans had to flee during the 1950s, 40s, and 50s, from the east to the west. So, and the Germans put in their constitution, the famous Article 16, which was in the Constitution until about 1990 or 91. And that law, this was in the German Constitution, said if you are fleeing persecution anywhere in the world and can demonstrate that, you have a right to come and ask for asylum in Germany. And that was reflecting German history. You can call it some guilt, you can call it German conscience, the Germans wanting to make amends. Some people have said rather cynically, I don't know if I believe this, that Merkel had a great quote. She said, if we save the banks in the euro crisis, surely we can save the refugees. So that she was sort of making up for the very negative image the Germans got from the euro crisis, because the Germans were pretty tough with the Greeks and others, now taking these refugees. So the Germans do have a very strong humanitarian impulse. Now, they had to get rid of Article 60 at the end of the Cold War and when Germany reunified, because they suddenly had a huge influx of refugees. Does anybody know where those people were coming from?
Eastern Europe?
Where the biggest refugee crisis in the 1990s was where? Somebody says it was in Yugoslavia and the Balkans. I was working at the UN High Commission for Refugees then. And the High Commissioner, a woman named Sadako Ogata, said, who would have thought, I come and take this job. You're expecting crises and refugee problems all over the world, and here it is, right on our doorstep. It was the Yugoslav War, which led hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of people to flee the Balkans, and many of them came to Germany. So they began to change the policy in part as a result of that.
But Germany was very methodical about sending them back.
Yes, they
the first time I went to
go back.
Berlin, I met one of whose job was to help. They gave them a nice stipend, a nice economic package, and now Merkel is offering a cash package to those refugees who will go home and will go home voluntarily and soon.
Yeah.
So yes, and somebody else, yes.
My name is Daniel Eichenberg. If I may make a few comments. You're experts in the field. I'm not an expert, but I've had a lot of experience because I work with immigration in Europe.
You sound like an expert to me.
And since about 7 years...
Are you German?
No. Since 7 years for the Italian government, mainly with Moroccan immigration. So I know quite a lot about it. Thank you. So, first of all, and I actually just came to visit now. I arrived 5 days ago. I've been in Berlin 2 months. And usually I'm in Torino and in France.
Yeah.
So I've lived through a lot of what the immigration is. And because of my profession, I'm interested in both sides. I work with the immigrants, especially the Moroccans, what you call it, minors, the underage, defending them. Also in France, Italy, and Germany, because I'm very interested in what, so to speak, let's call them the native Europeans think of this. Your last projection is exactly correct. The German people will say, es ist eine Katastrophe. It's a catastrophe totally. Some of your figures, if I may correct, were not correct. In Germany, in the last 2 years, 2,200,000 immigrants have come in. Now, so to me, when I visit the United States, I was also here before President Trump was elected. I'm not speaking about politics because I'm actually not permitted to. But I believe as a Jew there must be refugee for people seeking asylum, but legally.
Sure.
For example, I think it was you, madam, you mentioned something about, don't remember, in Sweden, all the refugees sleeping in tents. And most of the people in the audience make a sigh. Go to Europe and see what it's like. You haven't seen the pictures of Calais? All of the black Africans, since years sleeping in tents in the ice cold. Go to Valencia in Spain, since years, all of the black Africans sleeping under the bridges. Who's helping them? Who's cleaning them? Who's doing anything? So to me, I agree with you, sir. In America, all of this tohu vabohu seems like it's silly.
It is
In Europe,
rather silly.
it is a crisis. So, First of all, sir, to answer your question about Germany, I made a big mistake. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Wannsee, which is the museum of the Holocaust of the Jewish solution. There was a high school Hochschule class, and I was speaking with the teacher, and he asked me, what do I think of Merkel's policy of letting in the immigrants? I said, I think it's wonderful, but now it's exaggerated, uncontrolled, and leading to catastrophe. It is not humanitarian. It is not her choice. I was strongly corrected. It's what you said. It's in the Constitution. She must. Germany must take them. The problem is now there are not controls. In the last 6 months in Germany, there have been 5 terrorist attacks, unfortunately by Muslim, and 4 of them by, so to speak, these refugees or asylum people coming in. So with the Germans, it's not a happy situation.
Okay, well, we should probably let Pia respond.
Okay, please, I don't want to talk too much.
I know what you're saying is very useful to us.
Because there's also another correction I would like to say. It's so easy to say, criticize Greece, criticize Hungary. I listened to an interview in German television last week with the Hungarian, I don't know if he's prime minister or president.
Well, he's prime minister, he's prime minister.
Thank you. Now, last year, it's reduced now, let's go to Greece, 2,000 immigrants arriving each day in Greece. 2,000 a day. In Hungary, 10,000 a day. And he said, we can't do it. What are we going to do with them? We're a Christian country and we will remain a Christian country. So my point in this is, because as I said, I work with a lot of the young boys, the families coming into these countries, the immigrants. Bring them in. Then what? Human being needs to eat, needs to be accepted, cannot walk in the street and have people look away. I've walked with Moroccan friends in Torino. Italians will cross the street to avoid them. Does that make you feel good? And when we see all of this chaos in America, to use your word, it's not a crisis. If one takes the TGV, the fast train from Torino to Paris, of course it has to cross the border from Italy to France. So, it's a fast train. We wait 1 hour and 20 minutes. All the Italian police come in, look at all the passports, and in Europe and in Israel, we are not afraid of profiling. Examine anyone suspicious, look at the passports, documents, take them away, handcuff them. Cross the border, the French police and customs come in. This is every day.
Yeah, let's go back and let Pia respond, and maybe I can respond.
Well, that wasn't a question. I think you could move on to your question.
Yes, any other yes?
Can I raise
Yeah, wait for the microphone so people can hear you. There you go.
I'd like to first of all, thank you very much for your comments and you, sir, as well. Your 4-part issue, the one thing that gets most of the attention right now, and we're all excited about these things, is security.
Yeah.
At the opposite end of that square is culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that one of the great mistakes, perhaps, that people have made in Europe, as well as here, mostly in Europe now, is to ignore the impact of this spike in immigration on culture and people's sense of their own culture and the security of that culture. Can you address that?
To invite Caroline up here to talk about this, the cultural anthropologist. Culture is often a very malleable. It's very fluid. It's very slippery, and it's subject obviously to manipulation sometimes. But clearly, we are now in a mode of politics, I would say, both in Europe and the U.S., where there's a feeling of cultural threat, of sort of being besieged, which often gets translated into a kind of Islamophobia, unfortunately. And as I said earlier, it's not the first time in history that we've seen this. I mean, this is a pretty common thing in democracies. And one of the ironies, Caroline, I'm not sure that others in the room do not want to weigh in on this. People who are most afraid of immigrants, refugees, are the ones who have the least contact with them. So if you look at the voting patterns, it's really out often in the countryside, not in the cities, so in social science, this is called the contact hypothesis. The more you are in contact with somebody, the less you are afraid of them, the less threatened you are by them. I would encourage you to get a copy of the Controlling Immigration book, because it's important, I would say, to look at each country has a different mythology or a different idea about how it was formed, why it was created. And I think it's important to have this sort of national myth or idea, because it often can give you some strength in dealing with diversity. And I've often thought the U.S. has an advantage in this regard, because we do have this deep history of immigration. But it doesn't work all the time. Actually, there's one country. This will be a question for the audience. One country in the world which seems to be doing just fine. It's very calm. It's probably one of the most diverse countries on the planet. It takes in lots of immigrants legally, and I'm sort of glancing down at my colleague who is a native of Montreal, Canada. So what is it the Canadians seem to have in their recent history that makes them much more comfortable with this? Prime Minister Trudeau said the Americans are not going to take these refugees. We'll take them. Many of them can get here. He said he wanted a quota. He wanted at least 20 to 30,000. It was actually hard to get that many to come to Canada on such short notice. And now we have a lot of refugees and asylum seekers in this country who are going to the Canadian border and crossing over because they know the Canadians will take them and accept them. So you could ask yourself the question, what is it about Canada? Why are the Canadians so much more comfortable about this than Americans are at this moment in history? Anyway, I will leave it at that.
Yes.
My relatives are from the Philippines,
Okay.
and they have been in Canada for 45 years.
Wow.
And I beg to differ because the Canadians do not like the Filipinos in Canada. And I don't know the reason, but they just, like I said, they try to assimilate there, and they've been there 40-something years.
So Filipinos are more welcome in the U.S. than in Canada?
Well, the only Filipino here on our side of the family is my mother in Arkansas. And then, of course, I am.
Very.
Over the years, we've lived in a few countries around the world, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East primarily. And one of the things that we've noticed is that all countries have the immigration problem and have different reactions to immigration. For instance, in South Africa, it's keeping out the people from the north. In Malaysia, it was keeping out the Chinese. In every place you go, it's the same thing. It's trying to avoid having your culture changed by a great influx of immigrants. So while we have gone through I loved your comment about the ups and downs in the U.S., the Chinese Exclusion Act and everything else, everybody goes through these periods. Maybe we're just going through a period in the U.S. and maybe the tragedies in the Middle East that are affecting Europe and the tragedies in Africa that are affecting Europe are just a time that we're going through. What do you think?
I don't know, Pia, do you want to respond? You didn't help so quiet over there.
Well, let's go to Jonathan.
Yeah, and you know,
Let's turn to the medical profession.
Well, I guess the question is, how can, what are your thoughts about how we educate the United States? And I'm thinking of the O'Reilly show with the defense advisor from Sweden who we heard from Montana. And Pia, I was going to ask you, I didn't know if he was a close colleague of yours, but here you have our president making this thing out of cold cloth in Sweden saying, what is he talking about? And the next day on O'Reilly, there's an expert supposedly. And in fact, the reporter I thought from Sweden, she was very calm, I forget from Impress, but I mean, how do we counter
could
that?
I just say, I gave a talk in Alaska a couple of months ago, and there was some guy who looked like he just got off a dog sled, and there were like 200 people in Juneau, Alaska, and he stood up here, and he said, everything you say is wrong, because they are imposing Sharia law in Sweden, he said. And I asked this gentleman, I said, wait a minute, I was just in Sweden a few weeks before that, and I said, I was just there, and I didn't notice that Sweden had changed all that much, but he said, I saw it on YouTube. But you know, my colleague actually has great expertise in this for reasons that some of you might not realize. You go to Sweden pretty often, don't you?
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, I thought it was interesting that when I guess the guy tried to clarify that he didn't give that title. It was the staff at the Fox News station that gave him that title. So that was interesting. That he didn't make himself out to be, you know, this pseudo-government representative. But I think that Sweden, although certainly it was mischaracterized in a lot of ways, there hasn't been a lot of incidents of violence and so forth. There are certainly problems, and quite serious problems, and we have the rise now of the far right. Some people would call it a neo-Nazi. I don't know what, you know, if that's true, but of the new Swedish Democrats, and I think they're now almost 20% of the electorate. So there's
Are they neo-Nazi and immigration, a little bit Nazi?
yes,
Is that fair to say?
yeah. Well, a lot of people characterize them as that, and they certainly have many members that have, you know, in the past been sympathizers with, or neo-Nazis and so forth. So there are problems certainly.
In medicine, every year there's at least 20,000 intern resident slots that are open. They're filled by foreign born, and if you go to any hospital here, I forget how many nursing positions that are filled from the Philippines. And in fact, these other countries say we're robbing. And so we have a huge medical health care need that's being filled.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So it is true what you mentioned earlier, we have these waves culturally that we change perception. However, now it seems that it's different, and I'm wondering if it's because of income inequality. This country is going through a big change in the haves and the have-nots. Could that be driving this immigration scare? Which is, the data is not there to show it, but something is there.
Yeah, some of you were here a few weeks ago. We had a colleague who worked on this for many years, Wayne Cornelius, who walked us through the data on this and looked at what's driving the nativism. And you know, there are a lot of explanations to this, but you know, and political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists have looked very carefully at this question. And most of the studies that I have looked at, if you boil it down to, is it an economic fear or concern, you know, related to your income, your social class? You can measure these things. Or is it something else? You know, is it culture? Is it religion? And almost all the studies, you know, the cultural fears trump the economic fears. So it's not that the economic fears are not there or fears about inequality. But, you know, for whatever reason, again, it's a psychological dynamic. You know, people are often, they react more strongly against immigration, you know, based on this sort of cultural fear. And, you know, I do think one final point about this, that there is a lot of sort of relative deprivation. Do you guys know that expression? Where, you know, you've been doing pretty well for a while, and then you sort of hit a ceiling, and something happens, and maybe suddenly your income's going down. We had a big crisis, the financial crisis, which threw a lot of people out of work. So, unfortunately, in situations like that, people obviously they don't blame themselves for it. It's not really their fault. But you look around and you say, well, wait, why did this happen to me? And sometimes you can say, well, it was trade. It was those big corporations, those greedy corporations that caused you to lose your job, or it was foreign trade, or it's immigrants. There are too many immigrants in here, and those people are doing well and not falling behind. So there's often a sense of relative deprivation. Sometimes it's just economic competition. I mean, I was going back and looking at the Chinese Exclusion Act in California. It's weird because California historically was the source of a lot of this stuff in the U.S. It was always coming from California. Now California seems to be on the opposite. The Californians can't get enough immigrants. But the Chinese Exclusion Act, I mean, there were a lot of Irish and other workers in California who said, hey, wait a minute. We don't need those Chinese guys coming in here. They're taking the jobs. So there's always an element of that. And the studies that have been done, in the past 50 years or so, they mostly point to a cultural dynamic, a cultural fear.
But at the same time, I think the studies also show that, that highly educated, high-income people tend to like immigration and vote in favor of more immigration, whereas the opposite is true for more low-income.
Yeah.
So it does vary by, how well you're doing. But I also think that change, I think that all these economic changes really have played a role because there's a lot of uncertainty nowadays because because of the increasing income inequality, because of the shrinking middle class that now the data shows is shrinking. So there's less opportunities in the middle and people are wondering, if you're on the bottom, how do I get to the top? Because it's a bigger step now than it was before. We've had stagnant real wages really since the late 1970s. We've just seen some real wage growth on average and for low educated workers really just in the last few years. We've had the complete decimation of manufacturing. I mean, just as a result of China entering WTO, probably the loss of 1 million manufacturing jobs due to that. And then, so I think with all these changes, especially for blue-collar workers, they're wondering, how are especially their children, going to survive in this type of environment. And then, of course, there's the rising increase of cost of schooling and lots of changes that make people very uncertain and apprehensive about the future.
Yeah, one thing is for sure, the working class voters across the Western world, have shifted from voting for the left, voting for the right. The French workers one time were voting communist. They were voting for the left-wing party. Today they vote for the National Front. Unionized workers in the Midwest were once, solid Democratic voters. Today they're voting Trump. So, I mean, this is a shift we see across the Western world.
Well, shall we wrap things up? Right after the election. Oh, no, one more. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim and Via. I have a question, but let me first say that this discussion about immigration here in Dallas and even at the national level is very personal for me. My father hitchhiked here from Monterrey, Mexico when he was 17 years old. And I've lived the American dream. And last week I had a nephew from Mexico that was deported because he was working illegally in Chicago. So I'm your face to the news, people. Or my nephew is. Here's my question. I'd like maybe both of you to address this. And I'd like to walk us back toward the middle a little bit, just as some people are afraid of this so-called alt-right. There are Americans who are justifiably afraid of alt-left, and Americans who believe that the previous administration was a threat to our democracy and way of life. So here's my question. Are these fears that we characterize as irrational, and I'll concede that the security fear, thank you for the statistic from Cato, the security fears are not real, but are all of these fears irrational? And would you speak to some, if any, merit in people who want to preserve their historical identity? And let me leave a number with you. Surveys of Latin American immigrants living in the United States, so foreign-born immigrants, whether legal or illegal, indicate that 87% of them, of us, say that things in the United States are better than in their home country. Thank you.
The fears about immigrants are irrational. I don't know. I mean, I would just say that people fear change. I think that's really explains a lot of it. And I mentioned earlier, there is labor market competition certainly before the economy adjusts to immigration. I think the key is that if you have a growing economy, the economy will adjust to immigration. And so basically what should happen when you have more workers coming in, there should be more business investment because the cost of labor should go down. When you have more business investment, that means the labor demand goes back up. These people are, more people are hired, and so you sort of return to where you were, or hopefully now you have a bigger economy with even higher wages. But there is an adjustment period. And then there's certain areas that adjust better than others. And so I think, like Jim was pointing out, some of these towns in the Midwest that are hit hard by trade, some have also been hit by lots of immigration. So we have towns where, for example, the main economy may just be a meat packing plant. Well, historically those, recent decades have been staffed with all immigrants. And so these small towns have seen large influxes of immigrant labor, which of course is beneficial for the economy, but perhaps has created resentment, among the native population. So I think other areas, like larger areas, cities and so forth, where there's a more dynamic economy and there's more diversity, there's sort of more roles for everyone, and so you see less of this.
Something just one more that you said was very interesting. People fear change, I agree with that, and yet last November 8th, many of them they voted for change. What's going on?
Change that would bring them back to what they believe is what they had before.
I promise to go back. I became,
the change did all change.
I got to know Senator Ted Kennedy over the years. I used to live in Massachusetts, and of course, you know that he and Senator Simpson from Wyoming, they basically ran our immigration policy for about 20 to 30 years and passed the two great last immigration bills. But Ted Kennedy he had one rule about this, and he said, never bring up immigration or immigration reform in a recession, he said. Because, people are, when times are tough, you want to look after you and yours, and that's a sort of normal instinct, I think, that people have. And if I could end on just one personal note, Ed's, talking about his nephew and family, but I grew up in a very small town in the rural South, with the furniture and textile mills, and all of those companies have disappeared, and the town had lost population. But you know what has brought that town and that county back to life? It's immigrants.
Just like the Rust Belt.
It's filled up with Mexicans, Hispanics, and all of those dilapidated houses in those mill towns, they're occupied by immigrants. So, and I think this is a fundamental part of the American side, the way, the story. If we end on a positive note, I would say, we've had these problems and we've seen these wars historically, but this is an amazingly resilient country. Yes, we do have a pretty strong sense of community here, who we are, but we're an incredibly adaptable people, compared to a lot of Europeans I know who are much more conservative and inflexible about these things. So I don't think we should end on a negative note, and I think we should end on a positive note for the U.S. Because it's not a bad place, and we have done pretty well, I would say.
There is a note that, let's say it may not be positive, it may not be negative, but I think it may be something we're thinking about. A colleague of yours at the American Enterprise Institute wrote a column in the Financial Times and published a day or two after November 8th, in which he said that his observation was that the rallying cry for free enterprise has been replaced by a rallying cry for sovereignty. I think that may be true, and we better give it some thought. And you think about it all the time, Peter. So thank you very much, and Jim, thank you. And thank you.